Okay, now I'm ready to talk about a subject that is going to make everybody laugh at first, especially if you're a person of a certain age and you were a big fan of the Seinfeld show back in the day, as I was. And this subject is shrinkage. I'll give you a second to giggle. And take up and draw in, because these are three words that weavers, experienced weavers, throw around a lot. And newbies might not be familiar with them, understand why it's important, and understand how to do the calculations. So, shrinkage happens across the fabric and along the length of the fabric, and it's just the yarns in the wet finishing process going, hey, I don't have to be as long as I used to be. And a lot of fibers shrink. Cotton notoriously shrinks. You might have experienced this problem with a brand new pair of jeans. And shockingly to me, bamboo and shrinks. Tencel will shrink a little bit, but bamboo and tencel as manufactured plant fibers will not shrink as much because their yarn has almost no stretch to begin with. Wool shrinks a lot, and this is why wet finishing, when you're weaving with wool, can be trepidatious. Most people will choose, or let me put that another way. I choose not to wet finish my wool projects in the washing machine anymore, even when I want some shrinkage, because what I do want in wet finishing is for the yarns to puff up like Cheetos. I want that to happen. But in the washing machine, I have found it will happen at different rates in different parts of the woven cloth. So when I want shrinkage in my wool fibers, I dampen the fabric, roll it up in a towel, and sorry, soak the fabric for 20 minutes, roll it up in a towel, and then put the towel and the woven cloth in the dryer. And I religiously check every 5 minutes. Religiously. I set the timer. I do not hit the snooze button. I check. And for me, that has produced the best results. Other weavers will have other ideas for you. It's worth trying them out to see what happens. So you can see that the wet finished red scarf is about 3/4 of an inch. Let's get the ruler, Deb. Makes sense. Uh, it's about 5/8 of an inch narrower than the scarf that has not been wet finished. And that is because of shrinkage. The other thing you will notice, or not notice, I'm just going to have to tell you, is that the scarf shrinks lengthwise. And again, that's because of shrinkage. So I forgot to write down the pre-finished length of my first scarf, but I did do it for the second scarf, and it lost 3 total inches in length. The scarf with the burgundy weft was 68 inches in woven length. You don't really need to see all my little notes, but they're here. 68 inches in woven length, that is from hem stitching to hem stitching at each end. Uh, and after finishing, wet finishing, it shrank to 65 inches. So that's 3 inches total. And that was more than I expected, but it's fine. The other reason both that any weaving project gets smaller after it's off the loom, whether you wet finish or not, has to do with what's called take up and draw in. So take up, remember that when I was weaving these scarves, I had strips of cash register tape marked with the length I wanted to meet. Well, I was measuring that under tension. And so what the tension was doing was first stretching my warp as much as it could stretch, and it was not allowing the fibers, the warp and the weft, any room to play. Because of its very nature, weaving goes under, over, right? But the under overs are not following a straight path anymore. They need extra length to take that curving path. And that's what's called take up. So it's just every weaving project, you have to allow for the take up on the warp. And you can't really see it, but there are formulas. So generally, weavers allow 10% for take up and 5 to 10% for shrinkage when they're planning the warp length of a project. Along the width of a project, you also get something called draw in, and that you can see right away. And you can control it to some extent by making sure that your warp ends go in as straight as a path as possible from the front of the loom to the back of the loom. So if, for instance, you tie on at the front apron cord and your warp ends are bowing in an hourglass, you're going to need to work against that. So just scooch them in a little bit. The other way you can control it is by paying close attention to your selvages and checking your weaving width, because every loom woven weaving project is going to have some some draw in, because the selvages, and let's go in really close to these selvages, and this is again something new weavers might struggle with. The yarns, the warp yarns at the selvages are going to bunch up. They are supposed to. That is their job. And it's why they're the ones most often likely to break, because there's extra stress on them because they're being pulled in from where they're sitting on the loom. The weaving process is pulling them in. So you should have a little tiny set of pulled in threads on each selvage. But if you're getting big variations in your weaving width, you need to stop and figure out how you're going to correct it. Getting big variations, sorry about that. If you're getting big changes, more than, I'm going to say, 1/8 of an inch in the weaving width as you weave, you're not leaving enough room for the weft yarn to do its over under thing, and it's getting pulled too tightly. So to correct that, I would, if I'm getting even as little as 1/4 of an inch difference in the weaving width of a project, I would stop and take out the narrower part and redo it. And then I would pay close attention to how steep my angle is. When you lay in the weft, remember, you want to shoot the shuttle or lay it in at an angle before you beat, because that's what allows enough space for the weft yarn to go over, under, over, under, over, under. Because remember, it ain't going in a straight line. It's got a curve around the around the warp yarns. I frequently say the wrong term. You're just going to have to assume I actually do know what I'm talking about, even if I don't call it by the right name. So when you are planning a weaving project, the draw-in is because it's something you can control. It is something you don't really have to calculate for, unless you are trying to meet, unless you're worried you're playing yarn chicken and you're going to run out of weft yarn. And then you should calculate how much yarn, and you can do this by weaving a pick, and then beating it in and making sure that you've got the right weaving, the right finish width. Then mark it somehow. I don't know how you would do this, but I'm sure there's a way. Mark it somehow, unpick it, and then measure how much yarn this project requires to go from one selvage to the other. And then warp and weft calculators online will often have a way for you to put in this number, so you can calculate down to the inch how much weft yarn you're going to need, and then you should always add another 10% over. So warp and weft calculators on the internet, including the one on Check's website, often recommend that you allow a certain amount for draw in, and especially for take up and shrinkage, because again, voice of experience here talking, You absolutely positively do not want to run out of warp length on your project, especially when you are trying to weave to a certain finished length. And you have to allow for hems and you have to allow for fringe, although, as in this case, the fringe can often be made out of the loom waste. So be generous, overdo your calculations, and allow for more yarn than you might actually need, and you're going to be a much happier weaver. Uh, those online warp and weft calculators are just one of the best things the internet has ever done because they do all the math for you, and it can be really helpful. Let's say you are planning to use a warp and weft calculator. First, jot down all the measurements you want for the finished thing and then sketch them out. I actually do this for work all the time in the schematics that I make for our weaving projects. I show, for instance, okay, so this is the scarf project I just did. Here. Okay, so on this 3-scarf project, if I were planning this from scratch, I would draw the finished length that I want. Oh, and then let's say I had planned to hem them instead of fringing them. I would say 72 inches for the finished length, and then I would draw in 2 inches at each end for the hem. On this one, because it's fringe, I would draw in the finished length of the project, let's say 74 inches, and I would leave the space for the fringe in between them and make sure that I double it. So it's never a bad idea to sketch this stuff out so that you get a sense. Oh, and then I would just add all these numbers together that I need. Let's see, I had 10 inches between each of these scarves. So I would need to add the 74 inches plus 5 inches at each end, and then I would multiply that by 3. Then I would add in the loom waste, and then I could finally, actually, I don't even need to add in the loom waste if I'm using one of these online warp and weft calculators because it'll ask. So generally for a rigid heddle loom, you want to allow about 18 inches of loom waste, and for a floor loom, or a big shaft loom, you want to do at least 24 inches. Then allow for 10% of whatever that total is for take up, and then another 5 to 10% for shrinkage. And again, all that varies depending on your fibers and how you want to finish the cut ends of the project. But those warp and weft calculators, lifesavers. So shrinkage, it's not nearly as funny when it's your weaving as it was on Seinfeld, but it's important to calculate it. And my next project, because I am not going to just tie on to the warp for these red scarves, my next project is going to take advantage of shrinkage to achieve its incredible, beautiful, complex looking weave structure.